Roman baths had humble beginnings, but over the course of the empire would go on to form some of the city's most monumental architecture, and remain as one of the most instantly recognizable examples of Roman culture. The grand baths of Rome have their origin in the 2nd century BC, when they were little more than small washhouses, accessible only to men and focused more on practicality than anything else. In 25 BC, Augustus's right-hand man, Agrippa, provided the first bath complex that would truly be worthy of the image we have today of Roman baths. Prior to the baths of Agrippa, Rome's bathing needs were served by many small, privately owned thermae. These initial bathhouses were usually located on the ground floor of apartment buildings, and were more utilitarian than the later baths. They ran the gamut from highly respectable bathhouses for the wealthy to seedy haunts that were little more than brothels. The opening of Agrippa's baths occurred in concert with the large-scale building program spearheaded by Augustus that turned Rome from a city of brick to one of marble. As Rome matured into an imperial capital of a continent-spanning empire, the prominence of the baths grew exponentially in size and magnificence, as well as in the amenities offered. It had long been tradition for the wealthy men of Rome to spend lavishly on public buildings that they hoped would enhance their reputation with the electorate. But the inauguration of Augustus's Principate resulted in the gradual erosion of the prestige associated with the elected offices, and the need to impress voters took a back seat to impressing the emperor himself as the surest route to wealth, power, and high social standing. Just as the games and circuses provided an ideal distraction for the common man to keep them from dwelling on lost political rights, the baths served as the perfect way for emperors to show their beneficence to the people of the city without actually upending the status quo. During the late Republic, Caesar had spent his wealth on luxurious new voting facilities on the Campus Martius, but his heirs would devote funds toward decidedly non-political, even anti-political, aims. Even prior to the construction of the lavish imperial baths, Romans visited baths regularly, with some attending daily. Bathing was believed to be excellent for health, though in the days before antibiotics, the heated pools of the baths were probably the perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Baths and bathing were also treated as a sign of civilization, and so Roman thermae were erected wherever the empire spread. With this in mind, it's easy to understand why the huge public thermae were such stunning architectural masterpieces. They conveyed Rome's glory to citizen, visitor, and barbarian alike. Considering how impressive the ruins are, even today, one can only imagine the impression that they must have made upon the average Roman when the buildings were at the height of their grandeur. It is not difficult to picture urban plebs relishing the opportunity to escape from their small, cramped apartment for a few hours a day. With multiple extravagant baths to choose from, they would have been continually impressed by the majesty and beauty of these vast buildings that were richly decorated with marble, gold, and artistic masterpieces from across the known world. The average Roman must have felt that they were experiencing some small aspect of the imperial lifestyle whenever they visited the baths, and they surely felt some pride in the comforts offered to citizens of the world's greatest city. Admission was not free, but it cost just a single quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, meaning that they were affordable on a daily basis to all. But even this small price was sometimes paid by the emperor or another aristocrat attempting to curry favor with the public. These donations could take the form of free admission to certain bathhouses for anything from a day to an entire year. Though there was certainly a degree of imperial ego-tripping associated with the construction of the baths, they were still unprecedented public works for the benefit of the masses instead of just the upper crust. Their magnificence made them true societal melting pots with no real equivalent in the modern world. Inside the baths, even the emperor might find himself in the same pool as the poorest plebeians, and sources indicate that interactions between the highest and lowest rungs of Roman society regularly took place in the baths. The baths evoke a sense of public good and community that is missing in modern society. No expense was spared in effort and resources devoted to their construction, which is a far cry from modern public buildings. I'm reminded of a quote by Gustavo Petro, the former mayor of Bogota, who once said, "A developed country is not a place where the poor have cars. It's where the rich use public transportation. This is the same sentiment that drove the construction of magnificent public baths in Rome, the wealthy not seeking to create private spheres that were inaccessible to the masses, but instead viewed it as a sign of their shared civilization that they could elevate the masses. London of the 19th century was the first city in Europe to achieve size and development on par with Rome at its height, but London would not have a building on the scale of even the most modest public baths until the completion of St. Paul's Cathedral in 1710. Still, as impressive as the church is, it only occupies about 64,000 square feet. Compare this to the main block alone of the Baths of Caracalla, which covered 270,000 square feet. The Baths of Diocletian were considerably larger and were capable of accommodating over 3,000 guests at a time, about double the number that could use the Baths of Caracalla. Diocletian's larger baths took roughly 10 years to build, twice the time needed to construct the Baths of Caracalla. For comparison, the aforementioned St. Paul's Cathedral, some 1,400 years later, was built in a relatively slow 35 years. On one hand, the short build times of Roman projects are certainly impressive. However, it must be remembered that these feats of construction were the result of untold suffering, as they relied almost exclusively upon slave labor. The misery of the underclass made the delights of Roman civilization possible, and the division was particularly noticeable in the baths, as we shall discuss later. The Baths of Diocletian and Caracalla were hardly the only places in Rome for a dip. Prior to the construction of Diocletian's baths in the 3rd century, Rome already boasted impressive baths built by Agrippa, Nero, Titus, Trajan, and Decius. Only Constantine's baths would follow. By the time they opened in 315, Rome was already beginning to lose its preeminence and would soon be overshadowed by up-and-coming cities like Constantinople, Milan, and Ravenna. During the empire, the baths were available for the wider population and were open to men, women, and children alike, but not slaves. Admission policies changed over the centuries, and during certain times, one set of rooms was provided for men and another for women, while in other eras, the baths catered to women during the morning and men in the afternoon. Some co-ed bathing occurred, but it is difficult to gauge just how frequent the practice was. The consensus is that the Roman preoccupation with modesty and propriety kept it to a minimum, but a succession of orders against co-ed bathing issued by the emperors Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, and Alexander Severus lets us know that despite the moral posturing, the practice was difficult or impossible to fully eliminate. After all, you don't need to tell someone to stop doing something if they aren't doing it in the first place. It is important to remember that the baths offered visitors more than just pools and steam. They were social hubs, and Romans visited to meet others, play games, as well as just pass the time by talking. Some went to play the ball game harpastum, lift weights, or even participate in more violent exercises such as wrestling. This certainly wasn't for everyone, so many were likely just there to watch the elite athletes compete. In addition to athletic facilities, the baths boasted exotic gardens and libraries that were perhaps the only way for some literate Romans to read from rarer books. Because the baths were the central meeting place for Romans of all stripes, it should come as little surprise that they were notorious for being noisy and lively. These were not places of calm reflection. The Stoic philosopher Seneca lived near a large bath complex and frequently complained about the noise, claiming that it disrupted his studies. Before the advent of modern climate control technology, the baths were the best way for Romans to get cool in the summer or stay warm in the winter. There were cold baths in the frigidarium, a warm room called the tepidarium, and a heated chamber known as the calidarium, where there were warm baths and hot air to induce perspiration. Some baths included an even hotter room called the Laconium, which functioned as a steam room. This warm room was one of the greatest achievements of Roman engineering, and guests to the baths must have relished the comfort it provided. The luxury came at a cost, however, as it required a raging fire under the floor, which was constantly stoked by slaves burning great quantities of wood in an absolutely hellish environment. Enslaved people toiling away in agonizing conditions just a few feet from those relaxing in the baths serves as a potent reminder that the splendors and glories of Rome were never too far removed from their dependence on forced labor and exploitative relationships. To clean themselves, bathers would first work up a sweat, and then rub themselves down with olive oil that was scraped off with a wooden tool called a strigil. The initial sweat would make it easy for dirt and grime to come off after the body was coated in olive oil. It says something about the Romans' commitment to using olive oil for absolutely everything that they could think of, that even though they knew soap existed, they decided to wash themselves with the same substance they ate on a daily basis and also used to illuminate their homes. The poet Martial describes the bathing process when he tells readers, "Scrape yourself with the curved blade. The fuller will not so often wear out your towels." While slaves were not admitted into the baths as guests, they often accompanied bathers, and important men loved to be seen entering the bath with an army of attendants to carry their towels, to scrape them clean, anoint them with perfume, or just to give them massages. These same services were available for a fee to those too poor to own any slaves. But the poor, who could afford none of these luxuries, were forced to rub and scrape themselves by hand, or up against the wall, if they had no one to assist them. This humble method of cleaning ended up paying off for at least one old legionary veteran when the Emperor Hadrian saw him all by himself using the marble walls to scrape olive oil off his body. When asked about why he was doing this, the man stated that he was forced to adopt this undignified method since he could not afford a slave. Stunned that a proud legionary could fall so low, the emperor immediately presented him with a team of slaves and the money necessary to sustain them. No surprise, then, that the next time he was at the baths, Hadrian saw a large group of old men making a scene as they rubbed their backs against the wall, doubtless trying to take advantage of his past generosity. He asked them what they were doing, and they too stated that they had no slaves. So Hadrian sardonically replied, "But haven't you thought of rubbing each other down?" The baths had changing areas, but no lockers, so clothes were deposited with either a personal slave or someone that was paid to watch them during the visit. You had to choose this minder wisely, however, as there are reports of clothes being stolen or expensive cloaks surreptitiously replaced with shoddy versions. In an era where the poorest Romans had only one set of clothes, the loss of any item was tragic. But even the wealthiest Romans would have had a closet that looked sparse in comparison to yours. After reclaiming their clothes, the bathers would go their separate ways. The rich, likely traveling in a closed litter carried by the slave team that had served them in the bath, and the poor traveling on foot. While citizens may have been near equals within the baths, the rigid social hierarchy that dictated the operation of daily life resumed, without mercy, the moment they stepped back out onto the streets of Rome.
Hi, this is Titus from Tribunate. If you enjoyed the video you just saw by Gaius, and if you're interested in thoughtful content that explores the complex culture of the ancient Romans, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.